So we've got some new Perils in Paradise cards to review, including 2 new legendaries, both of which actually look, I think, kind of crazy. Kicking it off here with Incendius, a new 6-mana 2/10 neutral legendary. He's an elemental, and he reads, at the end of your turn, upgrade your eruptions, and then battle cry, shuffle 5 eruptions into your deck. And you can see here the eruption's actually pretty crazy. It's a cast when drawn that deals 1 damage to all enemies. So that hits both board and face. Unlike, say, bombs or plagues, the important distinction here is that these can also clear minions and not just deal face damage. Also note that because of this end of turn upgrade, these are basically always going to be 2 damage. I guess there is technically some way your Incendius does not survive through the turn you play him. There's like that poison minion that you know attacks when you summon something, maybe explosive runes with lots of spell damage or something, right? But 99.9% of the time your eruptions are basically going to start at 2, and then if you can keep your Incendius alive an additional turn, or perhaps copy an Incendius, make extras, because this is upgrading eruptions that should work against any eruptions that were previously added to your deck. So you might, shuffle even more in and then upgrade them again. They go to 3, 4, etc. But honestly, I think 2 is already pretty good, because that means you're getting 10 total damage out of your eruptions just off that base first Incendius. And sometimes that's also going to just be some little chippy board clears or softening up of boards, removal of small junk from time to time. If you have a lot of card draw in your deck, being able to draw through these more reliably might be nice, but occasionally they'll just feel like bonuses as well. This kind of reminds me a little bit of like Magtheridon in Shopkeeper Demon Hunter. Not nearly that good because it's not consistent. You actually have to, draw through and find these, but there's also this potential for them to get kind of snowballed and scary, because if you think about like, Brand Warrior doubling your battle cries, suddenly you have 10 eruptions in your deck. If you think about, Shaman with tripling your battle cries, you have 15 eruptions in your deck. If you copy your Incendius at all and they start scaling, if you resummon this and they start scaling, there's a lot of potential damage and inevitability. There's also like empty deck stuff you could do with Warlock, like burn your deck, put all the eruptions in all at once and do some silliness. So I don't know. I see definitely a few different angles. If this only hit face, I would say, hey, this just feels like worse plagues. This feels like worse bombs. But the fact that this can also clear minions and sometimes buy you those little moments of reprieve against opponent boards, sometimes just bail you out by clearing stuff, it just makes each reward card draw feel so much more rewarding in essence when you have that chance to pull that eruption and make for a really big play. So I think in some cases this could just be, slap down a turn 6 2/10 set up for later in a control deck. I think there are also, like we said, combo potentials where you're trying to drive into some sort of specific eruption combo. I should acknowledge, like, the 10 health on this is like, it's a pretty nice spot where even on turn 6, this could create some problems for opponents where it's like, man, 10 is just hard enough to deal with. I think there will be instances with just hard removal, minions on board, but this kind of has that soft taunt aspect as well. It reminds me a little bit of Maw and Paw from Death Knight, where you just kind of feel like you have to kill it or it might get out of hand. And even on turn 6, 10 health is enough to like make people work for it. So there is kind of the disruption of this almost on board a little bit, where the opponent has to make some tough decisions about either letting this snowball kind of get out of hand with big eruptions, maybe leaving it on board. You could try to give it stealth and stuff too. That's probably not worth it as much. But I think just that friction it creates on board does have some upside as well. So I actually am pretty high on Incendius. I think this card looks quite high potential because it hits board and face, not just face. So moving on to a new mage legendary. This one looks really good. This is King Tide. He is a 4-mana 4/4 with battle cry. Both players' spells cost 5 until the end of your next turn, which, keep in mind, this can also be played in Druid, because Druid is going to be touring in Mage this expansion. So big spell Mage and big spell Druid both look like pretty cool possibilities for this card. Keep in mind, Mage has some really good big spells that they could be cheating out on turn 5 here. Like, you play King Tide on turn 4, you play Sunset Volley on turn 5. That is crazy good because you're going to be like resolving your opponent's board, often chipping up through minions and stuff. It's got some board maintenance, and you're going to be summoning a 10 cost minion as well. Like, that is an absolutely game-winning sort of line all in its own right. You know, a bit of a down turn 4, but not really, and then a crazy turn 5. You know, you also got, you know, projection orb. This might be something you want to save for later, but technically, you know, possibility. For Druid, it's not quite as exciting right now. They've got like Drum Circle, which, you know, I don't know. This is not a great play necessarily on turn 5, but it's not terrible. You know, you might be willing to do that, but I don't know if you'd build a whole deck around it necessarily. And then like Crystal Cluster, you could kind of technically save a little mana, and I don't know if that'd be worth it either. So Druid doesn't have as obvious a lines right now as Mage. Mage has quite a few good targets. We didn't talk about Yogg in the box, but I think Sunset Volley in particular is just crazy high potential. King Tide on 4 and a Sunset Volley on 5. Now, keep in mind, this is also a symmetrical effect. So there is some risk that if your opponent is also playing Sunset Volley, that you play your King Tide on 4, you give them the turn back, right? And then they can Sunset Volley you right away because their cards are also going to cost 5. So, you know, mirror matches or decks with just big spells do become a bit of a problem for King Tide, sort of waiting. But if you are identifying that you're in a mirror match, maybe you just don't play your King Tide, right? Maybe you just save this one for later. Maybe you try to do some kind of pop off where you go like, you know, turn 9, you do this on a Sunset Volley, and then the next turn you play 2 Sunset Volleys or whatever big things. If you've copied some, you know, you could do like turn 9, King Tide into Sunset Volley, and then, you know, Sunset Volley into Projection Orb for like a crazy kind of turn 9, turn 10 punch. Because, you know, remember, this counts both the turn you play King Tide if you have enough mana left over, and until the end of your next turn. So there is kind of a 2-turn window there. That might help you dodge a little bit of the threat in like mirror match scenarios or whatever, or to set up for a big finisher as well. Kind of that 2-turn finisher. On top of that, this also has disruptive potential, because if you're not in a mirror match, if you're not in a matchup where the opponent has big spells, you might be playing a deck that relies on a lot of small spells. And in fact, we've seen a ton of small spell stuff printed in this expansion, all these little like 1 mana fodder spells and stuff. King Tide could be well timed to disrupt your opponent. And even if you're not using it as like a key low theb moment where you're trying to stop like lethal or a combo or whatever, just tempoing this out sometimes on turn 4 while setting up for your big turn 5 play could still disrupt the opponent, just interrupt them a little bit. They kind of have to float some mana or, you know, do something weird or play a minion they don't really want to. So you have the opportunity to kind of, you know, interrupt their tempo while also developing your own crazy kind of play. And in those matchups where you do limit the opponent and then you Sunset Volley, like, forget it, dude. Game-winning line. That's going to completely swing things so hard in your favor that I think this card just looks super strong. Opens up a lot of potential threat. Opens up some crazy swings, has a lot of disruption factor as well against things printed in this expansion. This just looks like a home run across the board for Mage. Druid, I don't see the lines quite as readily, but, you know, this might be something that Druid just tosses in for some disruption from time to time. Or, you know, maybe we got some like double Drum Circle decks or something showing up. I don't see that line as clearly, but nonetheless, Mage, I think, has a lot of play for this card. It looks really good. Moving on to some neutral cards. Surely these are the last of the neutral cards. We got a couple pirates. The Hosen Roughhouser. This is a 3-mana 2/4 pirate. Whenever another friendly pirate attacks, give it +1/+1. And yeah, I kind of like this card, actually. Number one, pretty cool with like patches. We saw all those, you know, potential 1/1 charging pirates get summoned. This is a whenever as well, so the damage will connect on that attack. It's not like just buffing it up for later. This reminds me a little bit of like, you know, Paladin's like Crusader aura. Obviously the buff is notably smaller, but this is a neutral card. It's cheaper and it has a body and it does a similar sort of thing. So if you do get out ahead a little bit with your pirate board and the opponent, you know, just doesn't have that answer going into turn 3, even just 2 or 3 minions on board, this is really going to shore up a ton of stats. You know, if this buffs 2 or 3 things, you might be looking at a bonus 3/3 in output here, kind of making this look a bit like, you know, a 3-mana 5/7, and the threat still persists. So some people might describe this as a little bit of a win more card in a way, because if you don't have that board, if you don't have stuff ready to attack, this one does feel a little bit stranded. That is a risk, obviously, but I think in other instances, this is just going to be a win the game sort of card that assures you victory or helps seal a precarious position, in essence, where you just need extra damage, because this can just be damage sometimes in a pinch. You might be 4 or 5 off lethal, and this gets you there because of this buff. But also sometimes just making that board unresolvable early could really give you opportunity to move forward. So, and it's a pirate himself, so any like pirate play synergies or whatever also exists for the Roughhouser. So I do think this actually looks pretty solid for these like aggressive pirate decks. Moving on to the Coconut Cannoneer. This is another pirate, 2 mana 1/4 this time. This one reads, after an adjacent minion attacks, deal 1 damage to a random enemy. So kind of a similar idea here, of course, an attack-based bonus. This one does not demand that it's pirates. This works with any adjacent minion, so there could just be some generic, board of tokens or rush cards or whatever. Hunter has a bunch of little 1/1 hounds or something, and you play the Cannoneer down, and you start like trading those in, and this kind of gives you some ping effects, almost, I don't know, knife juggler-esque in a way, like just getting some stuff. But I don't think this goes nearly hard enough. I just don't think this does enough. Like, it just doesn't push that much damage. I don't think it helps shore up a board. The stats here just really add up a lot. This also gives you damage and stats, like survivability and damage. This is just a little ping, and it's random. So how often is it going to hit what you need? It's like some chip face damage, but ultimately I don't see how this gets there. I just don't think the output on this one is nearly as high or contributing to a game plan. So even though this has a bit more flexibility, I think the output's just too low. Moving on, this is a crazy card, the Adaptive Amalgam, a 1 mana 1/2. It is an all type, of course, as an amalgam, which makes it a pirate, but perhaps more importantly, it makes it a mech, because this reads Death Rattle, shuffle this into your deck. It keeps any enchantments, which does mean magnetic counts. So if you play this as a mech and you magnetize a mech onto it, it's going to keep that enchantment when it dies. You're going to draw yourself potentially really powerful, highly statted sort of card. You can put some silly stuff on this and give it rush, give it divine shield, give it some kind of lifesteal or keyword or whatever, and you have yourself a really nice draw. The problem we've always seen with these kind of shuffle into your deck cards is it's hard to find them again unless you have like specific tutors, or you're in some way or another burning through your deck that it's showing up often. They sometimes have a hard time returning enough value to be worth it. So that would still be my concern here for the Amalgam. But I will say, because this has so many different type options, and because that just creates a lot of avenues to see play, Magnetic is the most obvious one that comes to mind for me, but I'm sure there are other great examples of enchantments already in the game right now, various buffs and so on, that just make this look pretty exciting. Even like Hand Buff Paladin, this is like, okay, give it a bunch of stats, there's an extra card there. So I don't know, I definitely think this has more chance than most of these shuffle style cards that do seem to be more meme territory than competitive territory, but this might actually crack the case just because it's so flexible. Moving on to the Beached Whale. This card is just like all memes, dude. There is an ogre wearing like pink polka dot bikini underwear. I don't know if you can see that if you're watching this on a phone. Lucky you if you can't. But more importantly, perhaps, this is a 4/20 minion. Funny numbers indeed. It's 7 mana. It's got Taunt and Battle Cry, deal 10 damage to this minion. So of course, when played out, this is just a 4/10. I'm not very excited about 7 mana 4/10 taunts these days. Sometimes they're fine when they pop up in hand. You discover them, they get summoned or whatever. You're happy. But importantly, with this one, if you do summon it, if it gets evolved into this, if there's some way you pull this out of your deck without having to actually play it and thereby activate its Battle Cry, then it's a 4/20. I am honestly a lot more excited about a 4/20. That is obviously something that would just completely shut out any minion-based strategies that don't have removal. Like, that's just going to clean up every little token board. Is that enough to actually get squeezed into a deck? Like, I doubt it. We don't have any like big cheat decks right now in the meta as such. I mean, there are some things you do like Kangor and Paladin or something where this could get someone into play. Like, there's definitely cheese potential, and therefore I'm not going to give this card the dreaded 1 star or anything. I just don't think it's still quite enough. I think other keywords, other effects, immediate reactivity matters a little bit more sometimes than just big dumb stats in an era where there is still a lot of universal removal. So More intriguing than most because 20 is just a crazy big number, but I still unfortunately have my doubts. So moving on here, we have the Sleepy Resident, a 4-mana 3/5 taunt, death rattle. All other minions fall asleep, and we've had so few references to the asleep mechanic in Hearthstone, despite it being there since the beginning. Right when you play a minion, that's got the Z's out next to it, meaning it can't attack. So for the use case here, basically you play this down. If your opponent has, like, let's say 4 3/3s on board, they trade 2 3/3s into the Sleepy Resident to kill it off. This death rattle resolves. The other 2 3/3s would then no longer be able to attack. So potentially could kind of freeze a board in essence for that turn, kind of limiting your opponent's ability to push through with multiple things. Or if you like play this down and they wanted to use rush minions to clear it so they could attack face, a common thing we see. If they use the rush minions to clear this, the minions left behind would no longer be able to attack face because they fall asleep. So this is sort of surprisingly disruptive against wide sorts of boards. That said, we just don't see cards like this get played. Like, yes, it's cool. Yes, it has a positive effect. Decks just can't make room for these sorts of things. They just need more synergistic cards, more direct and active sort of answers to boards. Nobody's going to cut a board clear for this sort of thing. So it's a pretty cool design. I think it's pretty fun. I just don't think it's going to get played a ton. Moving on to the Wave Pool Thrasher, a 4-mana 4/5 elemental with Battle Cry. Give all other minions -1/-1. So it's kind of a cool little debuff against, again, wide boards from your opponent. And then Death Rattle, give all other minions +1/+1. So, ideally, I guess, you play this down, you debuff your opponent's board, they can't deal with it, and then, follow it up, you play a board, trade it in or something, and, you get a nice buff. I think that's cool when it happens. I just don't think that's going to happen very often at all. I think that's far too idealistic. There is kind of a neat implication, though, against, like, tokens for this. This can just wipe out a board of 1 health stuff, which could be something some decks value. They don't have access to a lot of other good sweep-style cards that just deal with those sorts of boards. Again, though, this is so specific and so situational. It's hard for decks to make room for cards like this. Sometimes you just want a card that deals 3 to the board instead of something like this that can be a little bit sneakier or weird. And realizing the upside on this Death Rattle, I think, is going to be pretty challenging as well. Not to mention the Death Rattle just has risks, too. If the opponent, develops a board and then uses a spell to kill your Thrasher, it's going to buff their board, and you're like, oh, crap. It's really backfired. So pretty cool design again. Just another one that's pretty hard to use. Moving on to the Terrible Chef, a 3-mana 2/1 undead. I like this one a little bit. Battlecry, summon a 0/2 Nerubian Egg, and then Death Rattle, destroy it. So this is pretty cool, right? This is just a pile of bodies. It's got some undead synergies, which I could see mattering for corpses and undead stuff in Death Knight. I also like that this activates the egg for you. In total, you're kind of getting 6/5 in active stats for your 3-drop. There are sometimes bonuses to having eggs on board as well. Things like buffs and so on. So the stickiness here and the total stat output here and some of the multiple body synergies make this card intriguing. I don't know that this is better than just a lot of the other undead swarmy type stuff that Death Knight has access to, but I wouldn't be shocked if it's playable. I think for a neutral card, this looks pretty good. Next up is the Resort Valet, a new 4-mana 3/5 Battlecry. Discover a card from the newest expansion. And that wording's pretty key because this will update in future expansions, presumably, where you get to discover the newest, coolest stuff, which I guess is kind of fun for people on a budget, like free-to-play players who don't maybe have a lot of cards or can't access all the new things. It's going to allow you a way to do that. But ultimately, from a competitive standpoint, I think 4 mana is just too much for a Discover. It is nice that this is a narrow Discover, but unfortunately, so many neutral cards and stuff clog Discover pools that aren't more targeted, like spells specifically, that gets you into your class range, that I think this just won't be run. 4 mana is pretty expensive for that sort of effect. And then finally, the Cryopractor, the way I've always pronounced it, Chiropractor. It's a 3-mana 3/3 Battlecry. Give a minion +3/+3 and freeze it. We've seen this sort of effect before. I think some Shaman spell or something had something pretty similar. Ultimately, I think this is, again, going to be way too hard to use. Like, yeah, you could buff a taunt or something and make it a little more stable, but it's just clunky because of the freeze aspect. That's going to be a big negative in many cases. You could also use this to freeze your opponent's stuff, but we have much cheaper freezes that don't have this kind of stat downside or cost baked into them. So for me, I just don't see how this card gets there. So all that said, now let's do some quick reviews. Incendius is a 4-star card. King Tide is a 5-star card. Hosen Roughhouser is a 4-star card. Coconut Cannoneer is a 2-star card. Adaptive Amalgam is a 3-star card. Beached Whale is a 2-star card. Sleepy Resident is a 2-star card. Wavepool Thrasher is a 2-star card. Terrible Chef is a 3-star card. Resort Valet is a 1-star card. Cryopractor is a 1-star card. And there you go, folks. Some pretty cool stuff today. Yeah, I like a lot of these designs. Some fun cards, some good cards, some bad cards, but still at least they have like creative effects and stuff. So share your thoughts on all these down in the comments below. Thanks as much always for watching. And until next time, game on.